What kind of economic systems are best at allowing us to exercise the fact that we are created in the image and likeness of God?
Now keep in mind that if you take tiny steps towards any goal, it's just a matter of when you're going to reach it.
Scarcity is the first lesson of economics. Now, the first lesson of politics is to forget the first lesson of economics.
If you don't provide real, actual value to people in exchange for the money that you're asking for in return, you will lose over time.
We can see the economy as a social web that God has created for people to serve each other with their work.
We have the Word of God that provides for us a foundation for knowledge, for truth, for beauty, for goodness, for dignity and value in human beings. We have the Word of God that provides for us things like this. Ready? Thou shalt not steal.
Ethics on the legitimacy of wealth and entrepreneurship individually. Secondly, postmillennial eschatology, that is, the kingdom of God expands across the earth before Jesus comes back in final judgment. And the link to get those two together is the idea of the pursuit of self-interest leading to widespread economic growth and social transformation.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Christ in Capital, the show that wants to encourage you to love God, love neighbor, and build something. I'm the host, Dustin Johnson, and today I have on with me J.C.L, also known as Josh Faltot. Josh, what's up?
Hey, how you doing, Dustin? Thanks for having me on, man.
Awesome. So for the listeners, Josh, JC, is an author. I'll actually let you kind of take over and give us a brief rundown of your work and what people can expect from you in the future, that kind of thing. Just a little nugget or two.
Give my 30-second elevator speech, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm based out of Cleveland. I'm a self-published author. I've written a few books. I've been podcasting now for about 3-4 years or so. I have 2 podcasts called The Writer's Lens, where I examine storytelling. I look at stories, films, books, pretty much anything I can get my hand on that has archetypes and certain themes that influence culture. And then my second podcast is The Narrative Wars, which I always call the darker side of my podcasting endeavors because it's a bit heavier and heftier in content and really looks a little bit more at societal and political leanings on things, and sharp stories that come out.
Yep.
With which I guess will always kind of filters back to the culture, but really deals with worldview issues.
Yes.
As well. So that's I guess you could say that one's probably a little more fun for being righteously angry.
Yeah.
If you wanted to go check that one out.
I think that was one of the things that kind of started, I guess, kind of got me to reach out to you, because I was listening to a couple of the Writer's Lens and Narrative Wars podcasts. I think Narrative Wars you had, or maybe it was on Writer's Lens, you had one about Robin Hood, and the discussion there between, like, is it okay to steal from the rich, and kind of exploring that whole thing. You also had one about the Terminator and glorious masculinity, or I don't remember exactly the phrasing, but it was like good, how masculinity is a good thing, because that culture right now is telling us that masculinity is not really a good thing. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would have said it's the darker side, but it's definitely the more edgy side of your content. But it's great stuff, man.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that.
So let's why did I have you come on the podcast today?
Oh, if you want me to answer that, I mean, one of the reasons would definitely be just to have a cool conversation.
That's
because
right.
I love what you're doing. I know that you and I have some mutual connections as well through, despite popular belief, and through Jesus Smart and the internet. I mean, we were just talking about this offline, is how amazing connections can be made even via the internet, just with like-minded thinkers, creatives, and if you're on those same wavelengths, it's good to kind of get together and talk more.
Yep, and these creatives who are doing stuff online, podcasting, writing, blogging, all that stuff. I really like how Christians are getting into this area, and they're bringing the Christian worldview to bear on cultural issues, art, entertainment, all of that stuff. I mean, the first, I did an interview with Brian Del Turco on the Jesus Smart podcast a while ago, and it was one of the first podcasts I had ever done before I started this thing. And before I went on and interviewed with him, I went through his catalog and like was searching through like what should I listen to get kind of familiar with what he does. And I was scrolling through and I saw yours and it was like Worldview. I don't know what the name of it was, but it was just like Worldview Implications. How do you examine a worldview? All that stuff. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today a little bit. But before we do that, you put out a post on social media last week, and you were talking about how our it's election season. People get caught up in the politics, and they latch on to certain voices, and they we kind of get consumed by certain narratives and certain things that are being pushed in the media and all that stuff. And then when we take a step back, we can kind of see how much influence these voices have on us. And I wanted to talk about that because I think the biggest thing that kind of captures people is the story, the narrative, right? It's this concept of you have a story that's being told to you that captures you better than just blatant facts, right?
Yep, absolutely.
And so I want to explore that because I think our media organizations know that. They know how powerful it is to control the narrative. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What was going through your mind when you were kind of writing that post? What's that all about?
Yeah, well, that's just my ongoing, I guess, beef with social media, big tech, and news media giants. I've always had a bit of a thorn in my side, I guess, when it comes to journalism in general. I mean, I'm in my mid-30s now, and I remember just as a young person in my teenage years how being turned off I was by local news stations and even national news. Just because it just seemed like I was always being sold something, and what I was being sold constantly was fear. Be afraid of this, be afraid of that. You have to avoid this, you got to avoid that. And I mean, I took journalism in high school. I took some media courses in college, and I don't say that to pat myself on the back. It's just that I did some research. I did some things that you're supposed to do to become more educated on the topic. And the more I kind of dug into this concept of like, what is news and what does it mean to be in news? What does it mean to be part of media? The more you just start to kind of peel back the layers of, well, what's really going on here? You're being sold stories. Yeah. Right. Like if I had someone who was a news anchor and just goes on the local news and said, today it's 70 degrees, which I wish it was right now. It's not in Cleveland. It's about 30. So it's probably colder than that. So I'm just being optimistic. But if someone just said 70 degrees today and, if you're going on I-77, there's nothing there, et cetera, just giving you just sort of a data dump.
Yeah.
Nobody would care. Nobody would care about that. But if you spin it as though, well, there was a driver that, said this the other day, and now we've come to this conclusion, and there's almost always a hero and a villain.
Yeah, there's a protagonist and an antagonist in every news story. Yep.
And as long as they're covering the quote unquote hero, and the weird thing about it is that a lot of times in journalism, the hero is a victim. The hero is a person that has been victimized somehow, or has been, picked upon. And I'm not saying there aren't victims, obviously. I'm not saying that. But this prevailing idea is that if an injustice has happened in terms of you've been wrongfully sued by your landlord, and, we're going to cover that. Meanwhile, this person's been delinquent for 8 months, and there's all kinds of, there's a larger picture to every story that you're told. Yeah. When it comes to news organizations. And so that was part of the genesis behind it, was like, well, if I'm only listening to these interpreters of information and they're telling me how I'm supposed to feel about a particular storyline or a person's livelihood, then that can affect the way that I see everything.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. And we've talked about that on the show a couple times where it, the bigger, I guess, more pervasive narrative of oppressor versus oppressed, or victim versus, oppressor, whatever, is a narrative that is super potent. People latch onto that, and I don't know. I'm not versed in like the ins and outs of writing and all that stuff, so I don't know I don't know exactly what a meta narrative is, or like a, all of that kind of phraseology. But it is like this undergirding story that can be brought up in like all these different, like surface level narratives. There's an oppressor versus an oppressed and everything, and like you were saying, it's weird that we highlight victims as heroes, because that's never been what we did in the past in history. It's history is always someone who went out and did something, who proactively acted and overcame and conquered. That's the hero. But now the hero is the person who had something happen to them, right? And when you talk about that, obviously people are going to get pushed back and say, well, you hate victims. And it's like, no, it's just like we're redefining words here in order to kind of do this manipulation thing. But so let's talk about that real quick. We're talking about the narratives. The news organizations, the people who control our media, social media organizations, they know how powerful story is, how powerful narrative is. And they use lots of different tactics. And we don't need to get into all of the little ins and outs, but I mean, if you think about it, this past election cycle, we've had, just this past year, we've had so many like, incendiary stories in the media.
Really? Have we?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
The Hunter Biden thing was a really damning example of media controlling the narrative, right? You get rid of it, you snuff it out before the election. After the election, you come out and say, it actually was a thing. You had I don't know if these were all in the past year, but the Russia collusion stuff. You had the Kavanaugh stuff. Kavanaugh, gosh, okay. Anyways, different. You had the Jussie Smollett stuff, the Covington Catholic kids stuff, and this is all coming from a right-leaning perspective, as you can probably tell. But all of these things, there are stories behind it. They didn't just throw out, the facts. They didn't just throw out here's the data. They had something behind it. The news organizations beefed it up, and they had a protagonist and an antagonist. They had a motivation, and they had a beginning, middle, and end. And you've got headline wars. Oh, it's just
I obviously feel strongly about this as much as I do. Just from going over some of the examples, and the simple fact is that a lot of times when it comes down to it, like when I talk to folks about why headlines say what they do, the way that it always gets kind of set up is that there's a politically left side of the aisle to view things, there's a politically right side of the aisle to view things, and for the Christian, it almost seems like you have to pick between the two, right? Like you have to go, okay, well, I'm either going to be right-leaning about something or going to be left-leaning about something. And I have my own personal feelings about, I think, where the Christian worldview more or less lines up on some of these issues. But the fact is that, you had mentioned protagonist and antagonist through every one of these stories, and that's exactly what gets presented. Going back to the Thevington Boys story, that was insane. Yeah. That was just blatant. Okay, we're just going to run with something, and we're not even going to bother to ask any journalistic questions here. We're not going to see if there's anything else to the story. Probably one of the worst things about that story, really, Dustin, is that even if you asked people today what was the story about, they probably can't give you a good answer.
Right.
And here, the young man, I think his last name is Sandman or something like that. Yeah. He ended up winning a lawsuit of like $200 million.
Yeah, defamation's a big thing.
Yeah. And that's the story here in the back end, but there are still folks who will be like, well, I'm still kind of leery on what happened, and I'm not quite sure. And that's the thing that again, going back to when you asked me why did I pen what I did on social media about, interpreters of information, and I have to take kind of a step back from who I'm listening to as far as voices, because the way that the system has been set up is that you get so flustered by these stories and having to choose a side by what you're being presented, that you don't actually see where the conclusion lands. You don't even have an idea as to where the information is even going, because in your mind, you've already created the story alongside what they're giving you.
Right.
And
right.
so in hindsight, again, it's like, well, with the Russia collusion stories, for instance, what happened with those? Most people will still put themselves, they'll put themselves up and say, well, I think there's still collusion. Okay, well, 2.5 years and there was nothing.
Yeah.
Well, there's the in between. Well, it's like for 2.5 years you were fed a story that you bought into.
Yeah.
You bought into this story,
yeah.
and they, and I hate using the term they very generically, but it's very true that that's exactly what happens in those news cycles.
Yep. And it would be different if there was just like we were saying, just the facts that were thrown out there, or just some kind of data points, like you were saying, a data dump, and we were required to kind of piece it together and come up with what's true. But since we got invested in that for 2 years for the Russia collusion thing, yeah, I mean, of course it's going to be harder for people to drop it, because that was the story. I mean, that was the narrative that we got kind of roped into. And it's just so powerful. I work a lot of data analysis stuff at my job, and we do this with data too. Like you don't just take data and throw it out for people to use. You have to tell a story. That's what they're going to tell you. Anytime you take data analytics training, you gotta have your data tell some sort of story, right?
Yep.
Obviously, it's not going to be like a narrative, like a beginning, middle, and end kind of thing. But you're telling something. Something happened, and you've got to present it that way, because that's how people take it. That's how people consume it. And you just see it all over the place, like marketing. You do not just throw your product out there and expect people that are going to see it and say, hey, I like this thing. They might, but marketers are going to want to tell you the story behind the product. That's why I had, I don't know if you're familiar with Darren Doan. He was on the podcast a while ago, and he was saying how all these content creators now, the best thing that they can do is carry people along with them in the making of their product or the build out of their business or whatever, because that's what the people get. They latch onto, they grab onto the behind the scenes, the story, what got us here, what's the backstory, that kind of thing. I want people to understand the power of the story, of the narrative, and understand that that's how people, human beings, consume information. And you can see it in all areas of life.
It permeates through everything. It's funny you mentioned about marketing, because that's exactly what I work in outside sales technically for my other endeavors that I do. And I can't just call somebody or talk to someone who I've never met before and just say, well, yeah, I offer security systems, and then just leave it at that. I have to tell a story. I have to give you some sort of thing I'm taking you on with me.
Yeah.
So that you are going to either buy into it and be interested in it, or you're just going to be like, well, I'll look elsewhere.
Yeah. So your sales pitch is, hey, if you don't buy my product, you're gonna get a burglar break into your house in the middle of the night, so you better buy it, right?
Yeah, something to that extent. Something that, again, back to the idea of you want to be a hero in your own life. I mean, you don't want to be a villain necessarily. You want to be the hero. You want to be able to say, yeah, I was ahead of the game on this, and this person helped me out, and I don't have to worry about XYZ happening to my work or to my family or whatever.
Yep.
And that's how we look at life. I mean, that is precisely on point how we look at it.
Yep. Yeah. The whole idea of telling the story, controlling the narrative, bringing people into a step-by-step, phased telling of a story is In the realm of media, news organizations, that's been on my mind for a really long time, because it's just so frustrating. It's just super frustrating because our media organizations are biased. It bleeds into corporate media. I mean, just corporate America. And it permeates everything. So there's another level though of story. We've been talking about kind of the surface level narratives, protagonist, antagonist, all that stuff. But I want to talk about the story as it relates to worldviews. We have these assumed worldviews that are competing in the world. Obviously, you and I are going to take on a biblical Christian worldview, right? It has a theory of origins, or a story of origins. Where did we come from? It has an idea of ethics. What are ethics? What's morality? What's wrong with the world? What's the solution? And then where's history going? Right? There's a story. There's a story there, a story platform. You've got another one, which would be like a material naturalist evolutionary worldview, which is the universe exploded into existence, purposeless, meaningless universe. We evolved from a single-celled organism somewhere in the distant
amoeba
past.
or something like that. Yeah,
some type of cosmic goo or whatever. And now we're here doing this thing, and then history is going somewhere, right? Some people say it's the heat death of the universe, or whatever the secular eschatology is. But you also have another worldview that I think is coming up really strongly. It's like the New Age worldview. It's very spiritual, very I don't want to use the term magical, but it is. Speak things into existence. You create your own reality. What's true for you is true for you, but it's not really true for everyone else. If you ask Joe Rogan, there are spiritual elves. If you take DMT, you'll see spiritual elves all around us at all times. So, but
yeah, I mean, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and there's a whole bevy of worldviews that eventually come into focus. I mean, and look at Christianity, for instance. I mean, you could talk to 10 different Christians and probably get 10 different worldviews potentially outside of the realms of like the no negotiables, like Jesus died for our sins.
Right.
We have an origin that God created us. We are uniquely made in the image of God, male and female, both of us. And eventually Jesus is going to come back. I mean, there's some non-negotiables there that all Christians have to be on the same page with.
Yep.
The problem, of course, becomes how do you interpret some of these societal ills? How do you interpret some of these cultural norms or non-norms, and the history of governments that have been quote unquote bad, like really bad, or have been oppressive, etc. I mean, that's really where a lot of these worldviews end up coming out of, is that there's an experience level that has happened in the physical, and trying to solve the physical problems with physical solutions. So you get new types of government, you get new types of way, like, the fact that yoga has become so big in America to sort of counter the growing number of people that have anxiety and depression is really fascinating to me.
Would you consider yoga a New Age? Is that considered a New Age thing?
I would say that it is.
Or is it a religion in and of itself? Do you think so?
I think it's a New Age thing, but it does have roots in religion.
It does.
It does.
It
does have roots in religion. It's definitely more of a New Age thing. It's been adopted. Find your chi. I mean, chi is a very spiritual term. I mean, it's it deals with the idea of the chakras and unlocking all the different chakras. I mean, that's also part of meditation and yogi and all this other kind of stuff. So what happens, of course, in the secular realm is that it tries to adopt different kinds of things that it seems that ultimately are there to service the self. So if it's something that looks like it could service the self, then the secular wants to absorb that and call it its own and say that, well, no, this is our idea. It's like, well, no, not really. I mean, that's what I always that's what I always think is interesting about America, for instance, is that you have a lot of interesting individual rights and laws and policies that, at a very baseline level are very reflective of Judeo-Christian ideals.
Yeah.
And that's, and only within that framework of freedom can you truly be able to ascertain what the truth is. You give people the freedom to explore and ask questions and be curious. Well, that's a double-edged sword, of course. I mean, you're allowing people to explore all of their perversions while at the same time exploring all the principles of God.
Yep. Religious freedom is explicitly a Christian thing. It most certainly is.
Yep. I mean, how many Christian nations are there where, you have Jesus is at the throne of the monarchy? There's zero of those, but you do have countries where there's a caliphate, where there is a religious leader who's overseeing everything, that they are the ones that are allowed to interpret the laws. And then even if you look at certain governments, socialist governments, I really love that episode you did about how Jesus is not a socialist. I thought that was really fantastic, Dustin. So I've really enjoyed your writings on that. Just a little sidebar there.
Yeah.
Because so many Christians get duped, and I don't mind saying it that way, duped, hoodwinked, confused even on it, or they totally passionately believe it, that somehow Jesus affirms the idea of socialist policies. And it's like, no, he didn't. He never did.
Right.
He never was about that. If anything, he was, and again, I say this very carefully, if anything, he would have been more pro-capitalist because of what he asks of the individual to do.
Right.
So,
right. Or the story that he was coming in to restore. I mean,
yes.
The garden narrative, if that's not the foundation of capitalism, I don't know what is. I mean, property rights are instilled there. The right to own yourself is there. The command to go forth, multiply, subdue the earth, create, fill the earth, explore, adventure, discover, all of that stuff. That's God's doing. That's not a secular thing.
It is, and it's a decree that all Christians have that just didn't go away just because we fell out of the garden. Okay, that's still part of our, bearing the image of the Lord and what He's given to us to do. Yes. And so this, as much as it is like we use, the terminology, well, we live in a capitalist society. As much as we use that terminology, it's still hearkening back on a spiritual level what God had intended for His children.
Yes,
which was to act in such a way. So even if even as we talk about the more materialistic terms and, you use terms like that or whatever, you're still operating on a spiritual level where, you're either operating out of a spirit of Christ or you're operating out of something else.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And that's our story. That's the foundation, the worldview that the Christian is standing on. That's the worldview. That's the story that is, or I guess the grand narrative, the meta narrative, whatever, pick apart my terminology if you want. But that's the story that's going on. That's the story that you're inside of, that we're acting in. And so just to bring it back to the whole narrative thing, keep that in mind. As Christians, we need to be people who are keeping that in mind, and we're being creative. We're being culture makers, business builders, people lovers, God worshipers. That's our story. And obviously when you're going about your daily business at your corporate job or whatever, you're not saying, hey, look, I'm typing these keys because Jesus, blah, blah, blah. That's not what you're, that's all you're saying, but that's what you're standing on. That's your firm foundation, and all your acting is going to, if people were to ask you and keep digging down into why you're doing what you're doing, after so many questions, it's going to come back to, well, God made the world. He did. He said this. That's what it's going to fall back on. One of the things that is one of my, it's not a pet peeve, but it's something that I like to highlight for people. And one of the reasons I started this podcast is that what we're doing here in the marketplace, in corporate arena, and entrepreneurship and creativity, innovation, does not comport with the widely assumed evolutionary worldview that we, society has pushed upon us. I mean, like I was saying, if you were to ask someone why they're doing what they're doing, why they are an electrician or why they're a plumber or whatever, they could probably give you a reason. But if you keep digging, if you keep pushing and asking the questions, you're going to come down to the universe is meaningless. It's purposeless. It's all just atoms banging on the surface of the cosmos. It's just there's no meaning. There's no trajectory of history. And I hate to say that I want people to see that, but I do. I want people to see that, what you're saying about the world is not consistent with what we're doing here in the marketplace. It just doesn't make sense ultimately.
Right.
And like I said, no person is going to sit there saying, "Hey, look, I'm running this financial report because the world's meaningless." But if you keep digging, if you keep pushing down, that's what's going to happen. And I'm going on a rant. Sorry. If you
I was just going to add to that, Dustin, because I think you're also hitting on kind of our previous point about the way the news media is set up. And again, I want to be very careful how I say they, because I'm not trying to create some sort of faceless enemy here.
Ambiguous,
something ambiguous. But the reality is that one thing that any news organization or any media company has realized is that people have short attention spans.
Yes.
And because of that, the only way to keep someone engaged is to continue to be as abrupt as possible. And that's one of the things that many people, Christians included, of course, have really lost a sense of how to do, which is critically think and dig through those layers, get deeper and deeper into something. I used to be involved in a nonprofit called Alpha. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. That basically is it used to be it is still seeker sensitive model for getting unbelievers in the doors of churches. And it's a dinner, then it's a video, then it's a discussion like once a week. It's like a 12-week, I almost said institution. It's a 12-week study where you're trying to bring people into more familiarity from a seeker sensitive standpoint so that they can actually ask critical thinking questions. And it's funny to me that we even have to have something like that, because people just aren't doing it. They're not doing the critical, the heavy lifting on their own, because they're being fed all the time through media inundation, through some favorite voice of theirs that's extremely, or full of vitriol in their rhetoric or whatever it is. And so we adopt these things without even really thinking it through. And you can always tell when you find somebody that is totally kind of enslaved by this sort of thinking, and they're just basically repeating talking points, is that, when you start to actually ask those deeper, digging questions, is, well, how did you arrive at this? Do you really actually believe this? Well, what if this happened to a friend of yours? What if this was something that, you brought to fruition in your thinking? Where is this all going for you? And you'd be surprised how folks will just kind of give you these blank stares and just go, you know what, I never actually thought of that. And it's like, well, yeah, because you're now trying to get to the spiritual component of how and what motivates a person.
Yeah.
And that's part of their individual story. And that's why we just have such a hard time getting into those individual stories, because we're being fed so many others that are just that are partial, that are very partial stories.
Yeah. I've been tossing around this question in my mind. What's better? And let me just see let me get your response real quick before I share mine. What's better? Do you think it's better that we have these big news corporations? I call it corporate media, corporate news. Or do you think it's better to have these one-off, like YouTube commentators that are doing kind of the story in their bedrooms? You know what I'm saying? Like there's people that I listen to, like, or even people like Ben Shapiro with the Daily Wire, or like Tim Pool, or those kind of guys. What do you think?
Well, I think ultimately, I got a lot of thoughts on that, Dustin, to be quite honest. I mean, probably I think the thing that we have to recognize is that in the last 100 years or so, information travels a zillion times faster than what it used to.
Yes.
So we used to really rely, and I know there's a lot of guys who have talked about this, even in the secular world, and even Christian theologians have talked about this, is that prior to the 20th century, we used to rely on our elders for wisdom. We used to rely on people who've been around the block a while, like, what's the best way to do something? How do I establish a trade? How do I keep my head above water with my family? And how do I, keep my marriage afloat? Things like that.
Yeah.
And in the last 100 years or so, I mean, the internet obviously has accelerated this. The power to control information and then the interpretation of that information has swiftly changed. So
Yes.
you're not just, the individual is no longer sort of the purveyor, or even the elder is the purveyor of information download. It's some total stranger in many cases. I mean, think about it this. If you were someone, growing up in the late 1800s and you were suddenly plopped into 2020, okay, and you were waking up and you saw the news on and you were getting information about something happening in California and you lived in, say, North Carolina, would you look at that and go, why do I care? Like, why should I know what's going on in California when I live in the community here I'm never going to visit that place. I will never be there.
Right.
I will never go there. So there's this interesting thing about the big guys, and being able to have information at our fingertips that really, to me, is a double-edged sword of like, yeah, you don't want to stick your head in the sand, but at the same time, is it really just feeding the self? Is it feeding my ego that I have to have all the information down? I have to have all of this knowledge.
Wow.
I have to have all of this info coming just to me so that I can kind of have control over my little spot of the universe.
Yeah.
And that's really what ends up creating these ideological vacuums that people live in. And then you have people saying, well, we have to do this, we have to do that to change it. And the simple fact is that, well, don't allow so many interpreters into your life. You
Right.
can go out and live life. And, obviously from a Christian perspective, I'm going to read my Bible and I'm going to rely on the Lord to help guide my steps. And that's where there's an interpreter personally. But if we're always looking for, XYZ voice to give me reason and I hinge upon everything that they say, that can be dangerous for people. And do we really need that? So, I mean, I've always been a fan of local news just because I think it's fun.
Yep.
But I mean, I know I went on a rant about them earlier about how, local news stations I'm not really keen on, but that's more the journalist. That's more the journalist side of it.
Yeah.
I'm more so, there's only so many things that I can control where I'm at right now. There's only so many things I can do. Is it good that I know what's happening in India right now? Is it good that I know what's happening in, Afghanistan? Is it good that I know what's happening with a couple that was vacationing in New Guinea that
Right.
I've never met? There's
Right.
there's so much information that, yeah, okay, it could be a talking point the next time you get together with relatives at Thanksgiving or something. But is it something that really is feeding me life?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Am I getting fed with life by this information? And that's what I believe a lot of folks are just kind of going, well, am I or am I not? I don't even know.
Yeah.
I don't even know.
And as you're putting it that way, it makes me think, with America's system and how federalized we are, like the states are all kind of separated. They're separate entities that have limited oversight from a federal perspective, which makes it so that all these national news stories shouldn't really matter as much to you. I mean, in a lot of instances, they should. I mean, you should be aware of them. But, I mean, your local news should be the one that you're really dialed into and are acting upon. But the local news is dry. It's dry. It's, they just kind of throw out, what's the traffic today? Something happened the other day. It's never really sensationalized, but the big news organizations, the way that you just kind of laid that out, it further highlights how they are just storytellers. They're entertainment media, essentially.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, my parents have said that often. They said, I don't know when Entertainment Tonight ends and when the news begins. I don't, they've said it to me multiple times. They've said, I don't know what I was watching then. They look the same. They have the same talking points even. They're talking about the same stuff. I don't know which is which.
Yeah.
I don't know which is which.
I tell you what, I actually do. I admire people like the one-off guys who are doing things kind of independently, especially the ones that will actually pull up like the source documents that they're looking at and all of that stuff. I really appreciate that kind of thing. And a lot of times you can look at those guys and say, look, the big guys, the big news organizations, what they're telling you, the story that they're telling you is false, completely false.
Right.
And I really appreciate that. I understand that they're, a lot of those guys are biased, and kudos to them when they call it out and they say and they admit that they're biased. I think that's really a sign of integrity. But yeah, that's one thing I've just been tossing around in my mind. Who's better? Should I watch Fox and CNN and all these guys, or now Newsmax and whoever, or should I listen to Daily Wire? Tim Pool, all these kind of cultural commentators.
It's a good question to ask, and I think that to kind of finish that thought a little bit, if this is where you're going, is that it's always good to kind of pull back for a bit and then really kind of rest in the Lord into what spheres of influence do you really want me to be listening to? I mean, that's where we kind of have to pull back a bit and go, okay, where am I receiving life by listening to this voice? Am I receiving life by allowing this interpreter of life events into my room, into my home, into my thoughts? That's something that, as Christians, that's a game changer, right? Because I just think Christians should be able to be better at this than any other group of people.
Should be, yeah.
We should be the ultimate purveyors of this.
Because of our prioritization of truth for the sake of truth, not combating our own confirmation biases and all that stuff. I mean, that should be our MO. Truth. What's true?
Yeah, and that's the really funny thing is that when you get into discussion with folks that they're not indwelt by the Holy Spirit, or they're still in their flesh, not to get too hyper spiritual, but like if there's someone who does not know the Lord, I mean, and they come back at you with like, "Well, you have a bias. You're a Christian." Well, of course I do.
And so do you.
And so do you. I mean, that's just the fact, And nobody is an island to the extent that they are the most ultimate, quote unquote, independent thinker of all time. It just doesn't exist. I mean, you're always getting inundated by information that you are processing and you are limited by because you're just one person. You just have one brain.
And your past experiences,
your past experiences. Absolutely. So any person who, if they're atheist or humanist or secular, whatever, if they're a person that says to a Christian, look, you got your biases, it's like, well, of course I do. And so do you. I mean, there's no way that you can ever actually win the argument on either side other than going to the deepest root of it all, which is at that spiritual level, which is, well, where's your hope? What do you hope in?
Yeah.
Yes.
And
so that's
and the commitment to like the absolute truth thing. One thing that scares me is I feel like our society and our culture, and not trying to get super ambiguous because you can throw out those terms, society and culture, and it doesn't.
Right.
It just means so much that it doesn't mean anything. But we're on a trajectory or on a track where there is no such thing as truth, ultimate truth, absolute truth, right? It's all subjective. It's all relative. You can't really know that for certain, and you see that popping up in society, and that kind of scares me. Especially when you throw in these big tech companies that are censoring things, and you know that they're censoring things. It's like we're in it deep, and I think this is where the biblical Christian worldview comes into play, because really our best hope is that God is intervening. He's going to intervene, because if you subvert the honest and open flow of information, you're done. Your society is done.
Yep.
It's done. That's why I said, like, World War III, if there ever is going to be one, is not going to be a physical battle. It's going to be an information battle. That's why some people say we're probably in it now, but I don't think so. I think Jesus is on his throne and he's going to prevail ultimately in the end. And but we are in it pretty deep.
Yeah, we are for sure, and definitely an information war, digital information war.
Yes.
And who are the gatekeepers of that information, right? Like, who are the ones that are the interpreters? Who are the gatekeepers? Who are the ones that are actually trying to tell the masses, this is what's true or this is what's false? And one of the great horrors that you can put on a person is to give them false hope, right? And so if if there are interpreters out there that are spilling fear constantly and they're trying to spew some version of false hope, I mean, that's a tyranny as it is. But again, if we just keep redefining terms, like you had said, like using the term broadly society and culture, I don't like throwing out terms that have become buzzwords as much, even in my podcast, things like, a dictator or a tyrant. Well,
right.
Well, what is that? You have to define what is a tyrant, because a tyrant to one person is Trump, and to another person, a tyrant could be the old version of Joseph Stalin or something, and they're not very alike at all.
Right.
So you have to have this ability. Again, this gets back to peeling back the layers, Dustin, that we've been talking about. You have to be able to, and Christians again should be the best at this.
Yes.
We should be the best at this because we know there's a grander story, and every single person has a part in that story. And so we should be able to peel back a person's story, see where they come from, see why it is that they've arrived where they are, and then really challenge them with that question. Well, where's your hope? Where does your hope reside?
Yes.
What exactly gets you up in the morning and wants you to start your story anew? What is it? And if you're not sure what that is, then hey, wait a second. Hey, there's this Jesus guy.
Yes, exactly.
You've probably heard of him.
Exactly.
You might have heard of him before.
Your evangelism is showing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
or your evangelicalism is showing. Yeah. Yes. But it's true. Like, aside from the whole dedication to truth, prioritization of truth, and accurate knowledge and all that stuff, hope is the thing that Christians should offer to the world. We're in Christmas right now, right? We're in the Christmas season.
Hard to believe.
Yeah, I know. But that narrative, that story is everywhere, right? Even people who are not Christians, at least are celebrating in something that's roots are in the salvation of the world. Where is history going? What's the trajectory of history? What's the story? And we should be highlighting that.
Yeah, we should be. And instead of giving into whatever fear narrative or whatever crazy narrative there is during this time, because again, this is an opportunity, as always, at the end of any year in this country, to re-engage that conversation. I mean, to open up that, because it's in front of everybody. It's in front of everyone who's talking about Christmas, who's talking about the holidays or whatever it may be. There's a door that's open that normally isn't.
Yes.
And of course, even with COVID and the onset of whether or not you can actually sit in front of someone or over a Zoom call to tell them about it or talk to them about it, there's still a door there. There's still a conversation point that we can speak to during this time period that is normally not there, that we should take advantage of. Absolutely. Yeah.
Man, gosh, this discussion was needed. I think this has been one of my favorites for a while. So tell everybody where they can get your stuff, where they can get logged in. That's not the right word. Where they get plugged in. There we go. That's a better word.
Plugged in on my work and everything else I'm doing as far as being an interpreter out there. Yeah. So thanks, Dustin. So I have a website. It's JCLFaltot.com. That's JCLFaltot.com, which is going to be moving in 2021. I'm actually going to be getting a new web host. Hosting domain and everything, but for now, that's where I'm kind of stationed at. You can find me at Podbean. Podbean's is my host of choice for my podcast, but I can be found on Spotify. I can be found on iTunes for the Writer's Lens, and also for the Narrative Wars. And then I have an Instagram for the Writer's Lens as well, which I don't really use as much. I haven't really been using Instagram that much to my keen ability.
Yeah.
Which I think is an untapped resource personally, but I just haven't been able to get into it that much. But you can go to those websites, or you can check out my podcast anywhere and just check that out. My book, links to my books can be found on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, even I think is carrying my book still, and even some local stores too.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, we'll have my book. So
that's awesome. Can you give everyone just a brief little synopsis of The Road to Mars? I don't know. Did I mention that? Did I mention the name of the book at the beginning of the episode? I don't remember.
I don't know if you did or not, Dustin. And it's totally cool if you did. Yeah. Because right now I'll just do it.
Yeah. There we go. Here we are.
So the Road to Mars is it's a sci-fi. It's a sort of a post-apocalyptic story And it's about a father and daughter who are trying to get to Mars, essentially. They live on Earth. Earth has been war-torn by something terrible, and they're looking for what is called the shepherd. It's an individual that lives on Mars who is coming to Earth to take only those who are worthy to the Martian planet. And this takes place in the future, in a future Earth setting after something cataclysmic has occurred. And so it's about this dad and his daughter. And his daughter is mute. She does not speak. So there's this little element there that I play around with, but he's trying to get him and his daughter to meet up with a shepherd so he can get to Mars. And obviously there's a lot of spiritual undertones in this story.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. As far as, you know, what they're trying to achieve and how they're going to get there.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Thanks, man.
I'm going to put that on my Christmas list. Anyways,
good.
Everyone else, go out and get The Road to Mars. Get plugged into Writer's Lens, Narrative Wars. Can't recommend the podcast highly enough, especially for creators, writers, you know, all of that. Go get plugged in. Oh, by the way, do you is sci-fi your thing?
Sci-fi, yeah, I'm definitely more of a leaner towards science fiction.
Do you like?
That's my thing.
Do you like The Mandalorian? Have you watched it?
Oh my gosh! Everybody asks me about this. I have not watched a lick of it yet.
Okay.
I haven't seen it at all.
As a blanket statement, I like it, but when you and I might get some flack for this. This thing it is like it was written by a video game developer, because every episode is its own. Like, it has one tiny thread narrative that goes across the whole thing, but every episode is like siloed almost, and it's like you could use this as a template for a video game. It just seems. Anyways, I just had to throw that out there.
No, that's interesting, because I got 5 brothers, Dustin. I got no sisters, and most of them are sci-fi nerds like myself. And everybody's watching the show but me. And for the most part, everybody does like it, at least within my family group. And again, like I said, I just haven't watched it. I think I've just been so turned off by the last Star Wars trilogy that I just have not dug in with anything that they've done at this point. But I heard it's good. I've heard it's really good. But your description of it is exactly what, at least I've seen in reviews and what people have said about it, is that it was written by someone who probably grew up in the video game era.
It is. It's definitely evident that that's the case. Because it's every episode they're on a different planet. It's just really interesting. It keeps you. I mean, production quality is amazing. They did a fantastic job. But anyways, okay, that's my plug. But yeah, go get The Road to Mars. That's
awesome.
My summary. All right, everybody.
I like it.
So go like and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. We got some news coming out. In the near future, probably the beginning of the year, we're gonna ramp up some programs with the podcast. Maybe ways that you can get involved. Go to the website, get some merchandise. We got some T-shirts and things like that. So yeah. And if you,
nice.
And like I said, if you like the podcast, go like and subscribe, leave a comment, all of that. But yeah, until then, everyone go love God, love neighbor, and build something. Talk to you later.